Hey, it's Golden Buddha here, back with some more RPG horror stories for your listening entertainment. Today we have a story about a self-insert character that the DM made and tried to steal the show, essentially. The Chosen One, simply known as Lance. Roll post. I would like to preface this story by saying that despite what I'm about to say, I don't think that the DM, who is the subject of the story, is a bad person. I think he indulges in some very bad habits and perhaps has some serious issues reading people and understanding personal boundaries. That being said, I do think this is a story worth telling. We started out as a group of 3 people who met on Roll20 in a campaign that was an absolute blast. We had a great DM and everyone was having a lot of fun. Unfortunately, real life got in the way, as it often does, and our DM had to cancel the campaign. We all understood and wished him the best, telling him to prioritize real life and not to worry. At this point though, we were all very invested in our characters and didn't want to see their story just end without a proper conclusion. So we decided to see if we could find another DM in order to give our campaign a bit of a reboot. Same characters with a different story and setting. We went through a few DMs who didn't end up working out, and along the way, 2 new players joined our little friend group. Eventually we ended up with a DM whom I will be referring to as Fergus. He seemed pleasant, and we were all hoping that we'd finally found someone who'd work well with us as a group. At this point, our party consisted of myself, a goblin ranger, a half-elf paladin, an elf cleric, a dragonborn warlock, and a halfling barbarian. We sent Fergus all of our backstories, told him what we were looking for in the D&D campaign, and he got to work on the campaign. Session 1 finally comes around and we excitedly jump into the game. We spend most of Session 1 in a tavern. We accept a quest to escort an NPC called Lance to the next town, and we end the session as we set out. No red flags during that first game. Everything seemed fine and normal. This would not last. In the following few sessions, we're ambushed by the big bad evil guy as we're traveling to the next town over. He interrupts our quest and lures us into a dungeon. As we enter the dungeon, we see Lance's character token for the first time. I jokingly remark that Lance's token portrait makes him look like a bit of a douche, and Fergus gets oddly defensive about this. I found this a bit strange, as supposedly Lance was just a random NPC that would only be around until we dumped him off at the next town. So why would Fergus get so defensive about us making fun of this guy? It would soon become painfully apparent as why exactly this was. We pursue Big Bad Evil Guy into the depths of the dungeon, him speaking with us telepathically the whole time, mocking us, doing the whole bad guy monologue thing. All of a sudden, however, the Big Bad Evil Guy starts to exposition vomit and reveal in a shocking twist that Lance is his bastard son. Alright, so Lance is more important than we initially realized. Well, don't dwell on it too much and decide to just move on and keep pursuing the BBEG. We eventually corner him and engage in combat. The encounter goes decently well, but then suddenly, something happens with Lance. For lack of a better term, he goes Super Saiyan and deals a crippling blow to the Big Bad Evil Guy. The Big Bad Evil Guy does this whole, "No! How can this be?" before teleporting away. None of us were particularly thrilled to have had the final blow stolen by an NPC in what was very clearly a scripted event. But we decided to just move on. Missed a session after the party exited the dungeon and returned the following one expecting the party to have gotten rid of Lance, as none of us seemed to like him all that much. Instead, as I return, I'm informed that we haven't been able to make it to the town that we're supposed to drop Lance off at. There's also been a new development in my absence, and I'm informed that our party has been joined by a new NPC, a female goblin who Fergus introduces as my love interest. To provide a bit of context, my character did have a love interest in his backstory, but that was something none of the others knew about. My character, a goblin, had come from a warband which he'd abandoned due to being horribly mistreated, and he'd left behind a female goblin that he had feelings for. I was left in dumbfounded disbelief. Something that was supposed to have been a huge reveal about my character had been revealed to the group during a session when I wasn't even there. The picture he'd used to represent this character also wasn't the one I'd included in my backstory, and instead he'd used the one that was a lot more sexualized. Trying my best to remain calm, I asked Fergus if he could please join me in a private call for a minute. which he agreed to. I did not mince words and straight up told him that I was very disappointed and upset with all of this. He appeared shocked that what he'd done had upset me, but to his credit, possibly because my tone had made it clear that this was not up for negotiation, we decided to retcon the whole thing and make this girl a different character. It's worth mentioning that the point of my character having a love interest that he'd had to leave behind was to give him conflicted feelings about his past life. He may have abandoned his old warband, but there was still someone who he cared about. Apparently, all of that had gone over Fergus's head. He seemed to believe that the only reason anyone would ever want their character to have a love interest is so that you'll have someone submissive to fawn over you and provide sexual favors. And the way he'd been depicting this goblin girl, who'd been supposed to be my character's love interest, made me deeply uncomfortable. This girl had been made a mute, a huge trope for submissive women, and was infantilized constantly, jumping on the bed, playing in mud, and acting like a child. The more I interacted with this character, the more creeped out I got, and I was about to find out that this was the norm for how Fergus wrote female characters. Eventually, our characters did arrive where we were supposed to get rid of Lance, and nobody was sad to see this guy go. Lance was your typical edgy Gary Stu, devilishly good looking, having great power and yet always talking about how he'd never asked for any of this. He was as shallow as a puddle, and Fergus continuously trying to show us that he was the coolest thing since sliced bread made him infinitely unlikable. It's also worth mentioning that Fergus never missed an opportunity to try and make something happen between Lance and the half-elf paladin, played by the only woman in our group of friends. It wasn't flirting as much as it was him continuously trying to get some sort of reaction out of her. He'd have Lance show up without his shirt, describing in intricate detail the droplets of water trickling down his skin. He'd have Lance remark on her appearance, often making out-of-character comments about her high charisma. She's a paladin, of course her charisma is high. He'd have Lance make accidental sexual references and play it off as charming awkwardness. The player he was subjecting to this never responded to these advances and made it very clear that she wasn't interested. Yet this stuff would continue throughout our entire time with Fergus. Now, when it comes to romance and tabletop games, if a player isn't interested in it, you just need to fucking drop it. If you keep trying to push a love interest at someone who repeatedly states that they're not interested, you're going to come off as cringy at best and creepy at worst. Anyway, it would get repetitive if I kept bringing it up every single time this happened, so just assume that it is happening continuously in the background. So now that we're finally in a new place, we're introduced to the local magical artifact, which it turns out is a knockoff Excalibur shoved into a rock in the center of town. Fergus tells us that whoever pulls the sword from the stone is the chosen one, and that if any of us wish to try, he'll roll on a D1000 table to see if we're able. So pulling this sword out is supposedly a chance of 1 in 1,000. Now before we go any further, we need to talk about fake RNG. Specifically when a DM tells the party that they're rolling something on a random table, whilst in reality everything is scripted and the roll doesn't matter. Now when it comes to fudging rolls, I realize that people have vastly different levels of tolerance for it. I realize that to some people it doesn't matter if the DM fudges some rolls so long as the end result is something cool. I personally don't have a lot of tolerance for it, but I understand why it wouldn't bother some people. However, if you're going to do it, be honest about it. Don't pretend as if the stars just happen to align perfectly whenever you have a roll on a random event table. I find it absolutely intolerable when something is painfully transparently scripted and the DM goes, "No, don't blame me, the dice made me do it," when that is clearly not what happened. Fergus did this a lot. He loved pulling out what he claimed to be tables for random events, and yet the events always seemed tailored to specific characters or situations. Now, I think you all know where this is going. Everybody tries and fails, and then Lance tries, as we're just about to get rid of the bastard. I had a pit in my stomach when Fergus told me that Lance was going to try. It had become painfully obvious at this point that Lance was Fergus's self-insert character, and this would be a surefire way to keep him in the story. Lo and behold, the obvious thing happens. Fergus rolls a D1000 and then bursts into an exaggerated speech of, Oh my god, I can't believe this, no way! Of course, Lance rolled the magic number and pulled the sword out of the stone. And the DM's self-insert character had become the chosen one. None of us are happy about this, and we quickly make an attempt to say, "That's great, Lance, bye now, good luck with that." But Fergus isn't about to let that happen. We make several attempts to ditch this guy, which ultimately culminates in the spirit of the sword materializing before our very eyes and knocking us all out. When we wake up, we find that we've all been given strange magical tattoos. We are informed that we are now bound to help Lance in completing his quest to save the world. And if we don't, we will die. Now, to me personally, this is absolutely the worst type of railroading you could ever do. You literally shackle the players to your MacGuffin and inform them that doing anything other than exactly what they're being told to do will kill them. You've forbidden your players from abandoning a quest that they clearly aren't enjoying and don't want to pursue, and shown that you don't care about their agency. I was thoroughly sick of this campaign at this point and wanted to quit. My friends weren't quite ready to leave, however, perhaps because we had such a difficult time finding a new DM, and for their sake, I decided to stay against my better judgment. Beyond this point, the campaign turned into a lot of disjointed nonsense with very little cohesion. As such, I'm mostly going to sum up the most bizarre things that happened before we finally decided to pull the plug on this monstrosity. Two princesses showed up mere days after Lance had pulled budget Excalibur out of the stone and declared that they both intended to be his wife. An unfathomable amount of time was spent dealing with this stupid plotline. It ultimately led to nothing. They both just followed Lance around, fawned over him, and fought over him. So yeah, Lance had a harem following him around now. They were both anime stereotypes, and all they ever talked about was how badly they wanted a piece of Lance. During a later session, my character was offered a pair of dice to buy. Seeing the trap coming a mile away, I absolutely refused to buy them. Watching Fergus desperately trying to get me to buy the stupid dice was borderline comedic. It went from giving me a sales pitch, to haggling, to outright trying to give them to me for free. One of the other players took pity on Fergus and took the dice. I sincerely wish they hadn't, as we'd now given Fergus another weapon to fuck with the story in a way that wouldn't let him just blame it on RNG. If it wasn't already painfully obvious that Fergus was fudging these rolls, it sure was now. The halfling barbarian in our party had been raised by orcs and often struggled with issues regarding his identity. Well, he ended up rolling the dice and was turned into an orc. And Fergus seemed to think that this resolved his character conflict. Of course, this didn't actually resolve anything. It just changed a player's race without their consent. Not long after this, the dice summoned a naked halfling girl, which was clearly supposed to be a love interest for our barbarian. A love interest was literally dropped into his lap out of thin air. At this point, my character grabbed the dice and tossed them off a cliff into a lake, as I was utterly sick of Fergus using fake RNG to mess with our characters. Naturally, the dice just appeared in my pocket again. We literally could not get rid of them. We'd once again been shackled to something nobody in the party liked or thought was fun. I believe that this was when we'd all officially had enough. As a group, we finally decided to message Fergus and tell him that we weren't happy with the direction of the campaign and we'd like to make some changes. Fergus informed us that we appeared to be at an impasse then, as he was not willing to reboot the campaign, make any changes, or find any sort of compromise. Once we'd all been made aware of his response, we all quit the campaign, and that was the last I ever heard from him. I know this may be a bit of an anticlimactic ending, but I think maybe there's a lesson to be learned here. If a DM causes you this much frustration, then you need to speak up. By all means, give them a chance to make changes that would address your concerns. But if they refuse, just leave. They are not worth your time, and there are so many better people out there for you to play games with. End post. On that last note, I'm going to say amen to that. But honestly, a lot of these issues could have been solved if one of you had just decided to DM. If it was you guys, one of you could have DM'd and also had the previous character from the good campaign you guys played in tag along as an NPC. You don't need to find somebody to run your game outside of your game, because then you're kind of doing this thing where you're making demands of this person, and usually a DM already has something in their mind that they want to run. You all were essentially trying to get him to run an extension of a story that he doesn't understand or doesn't know. Like, you wanted to have these cool adventures or like cap off an adventure, and he just doesn't know what he's doing because he has another idea in his head. Now, the whole thing that he was doing with the female NPCs, I'm not even that's yeah, that's very anime-ish, and just you usually want to talk to people about that, or don't push it so heavily, at least. But yeah, next time just have someone in your group just bite the bullet and just say, hey, I'm going to run the game. And that's going to be that. You don't have to go look for rando DMs, because then you end up with stories like this. But yeah, don't have any lances in the game. No god NPCs. No one can stand a Gary stew, especially when they're in the proximity of the party. That's it. That's all I have to say on that. Let me know what you guys think about this story in the comments below. Like and subscribe for more content, and as always, this is Golden Buddha telling you to stay enlightened and stay safe.